On a frozen January morning in 1856, in a small cabin near Cincinnati, federal marshals burst through a door to find a scene that would haunt the nation for generations. A young woman stood covered in blood, a butcher knife in her hand, her 2-year-old daughter dead on the floor. 3 other children lay wounded around the room. When asked why, Margaret Garner gave an answer that cut through every justification for slavery America had ever constructed. She said she'd rather see her children dead than see them enslaved. This is her story. Margaret Garner was born into bondage on June 4, 1834, at Maplewood Plantation in Boone County, Kentucky, just across the frozen Ohio River from freedom. The plantation belonged to John Pollard Gaines, a lawyer who would later serve as a Whig congressman and governor of the Oregon Territory. Margaret's mother, Priscilla, worked as a house servant, and there's strong evidence suggesting that John Pollard Gaines himself was Margaret's father. She was described in contemporary accounts as a mulatto woman, about 5 feet tall, light-skinned enough that some witnesses would later say she could have passed for white. From the age of 5 or 6, Margaret was put to work in the Gaines household, looking after the family's children, helping with domestic duties, performing the endless labor that kept plantation households running. In 1849, when Margaret was 15, 2 significant events altered her life. First, she married Robert Garner, an enslaved man who belonged to James Marshall, a neighboring plantation owner. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal standing, of course. The ceremony meant nothing in the eyes of the law, offered no protections, created no rights. But it meant everything to the people involved. It was an assertion of humanity in a system designed to deny it. That same year, John Pollard Gaines accepted his appointment as governor of the Oregon Territory. He sold Maplewood Plantation and everyone enslaved there to his younger brother, Archibald K. Gaines. Margaret, her mother Priscilla, and about a dozen other enslaved people became Archibald's property. Margaret would later bear a scar on her face that ran from her forehead down her left cheek. When asked about it during her trial, she would only say 5 words that spoke volumes about her life at Maplewood. "White man struck me." She never elaborated, never explained the circumstances, never identified who had done it. She didn't need to. By January 1856, Margaret had given birth to 4 children. Their names were Thomas, about 6 years old, Samuel, about 4, Mary, 2.5, and an infant girl named Priscilla. Here's where the evidence tells us something crucial about Margaret's life at Maplewood, something the trial would later make uncomfortably public. Thomas was born in early 1850, shortly after Margaret's marriage to Robert. But Samuel, Mary, and little Priscilla were all described as mulatto children, noticeably lighter-skinned than their parents. And here's the damning pattern that contemporary observers noted. Each of these 3 children was born 5 to 7 months after Archibald Gaines's wife had given birth to a child. The timing wasn't coincidental. Archibald Gaines was the only adult white male at Maplewood. The evidence strongly suggests that whenever his wife became pregnant and was sexually unavailable to him, Gaines turned to Margaret. Whether we call it rape or forced concubinage or sexual slavery, the basic fact remains the same. Margaret had no choice, no ability to refuse, no legal recourse, no protection. Her children were born from violation. The abolitionist Lucy Stone would later testify during the trial about this pattern, telling the court that the faded faces of Margaret's children told too plainly to what degradation female slaves were forced to submit. This was Margaret Garner's world in January 1856. She was 21 years old, pregnant again, mother to 4 children, 3 of whom were likely conceived through rape by the man who claimed to own her. She had spent her entire life in bondage, had seen her children born into the same system, had no legal rights to her own body or her own children's lives, and that January was the coldest winter Kentucky had seen in 60 years. The Ohio River, which usually served as an impassable barrier between slavery and freedom, had frozen solid. This happened only once every few years, and when it did, enslaved people on the Kentucky side knew it represented opportunity. A bridge of ice to the free state of Ohio, a chance that might not come again. Late on Sunday night, January 27, 1856, Margaret and Robert made their decision. They would run. Robert's parents, Simon and Mary, who were also enslaved by James Marshall, would come with them. They would take all 4 children. Robert stole his enslaver's horses and sleigh, along with a gun. The family crowded into the sleigh along with several others who were also fleeing that night, 17 people in total, and they raced down ice-covered roads toward the Ohio River, 16 miles from Maplewood. It was brutally cold. Snow fell continuously. The children had to be kept quiet despite the freezing temperatures and the fear. By the time they reached the river at daybreak, they could see the ice stretching across to Cincinnati. The party crossed on foot, the frozen river holding their weight. Once across, the group divided to avoid detection. 9 of the freedom seekers made their way to safe houses in Cincinnati and eventually reached Canada via the Underground Railroad. They made it. Their story had a happy ending. The Garners weren't so fortunate. Margaret, Robert, their 4 children, and Robert's parents made their way to the home of Margaret's cousin, Elijah Kite, who lived near Mill Creek in a settlement of free black people just below Cincinnati. Kite had himself been formerly enslaved and had gained his freedom. His home was meant to be a temporary refuge, a place to hide until Levi Coffin, the Quaker abolitionist known as the president of the Underground Railroad, could arrange the next stage of their journey north to Canada. They arrived at Kite's house Monday morning, exhausted but alive. Freedom seemed within reach. Kite left immediately to find Coffin. Coffin agreed to help and told Kite to move the Garners further west into the city, to a settlement where many free black people lived, and to wait until nightfall. Then Coffin would make arrangements to forward them further along the Underground Railroad. But when Kite returned to his house, it was already too late. Archibald Gaines and James Marshall had discovered the escape within hours. They weren't burdened with small children or elderly parents or provisions. They made fast time and tracked the sleigh's path through the snow. By Monday morning, they'd crossed into Ohio with a posse of federal marshals and local law enforcement. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 gave them the legal authority to pursue their human property even into free states. They surrounded Kite's house. The Garners barricaded themselves inside. Robert Garner had the stolen gun, and when the marshals tried to force their way in, he fired several shots, wounding at least 1 deputy. The family knew what was coming. They'd made it to freedom, had breathed free air for perhaps 12 hours, and now they were about to be dragged back into bondage. Margaret had grown up at Maplewood. She knew what awaited her children. She knew what awaited her. She made a choice that a mother should never have to make. When the marshals finally broke down the door and stormed into the cabin, they found a scene of horror. Margaret stood in a back room, a butcher knife in her hand, blood covering her clothes. Her daughter Mary lay on the floor, her throat cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated. The Cincinnati Gazette would later report that the child was almost white and was a little girl of rare beauty. Thomas and Samuel, the older boys, were bleeding from cuts, scrambling under a bed to escape their mother's knife. The infant, Priscilla, had been struck in the head with a shovel, her face bruised. The marshals subdued Margaret before she could finish what she'd started, before she could kill the other children, before she could kill herself. The entire Garner family was taken into custody and locked in the county jail. What happened next became one of the longest and most complicated fugitive slave cases in American history. A typical fugitive slave hearing would last less than a day. The hearings in the Garner case began on January 30, 1856, just 3 days after the escape, and would continue for 2 weeks, with the judge deliberating another 2 weeks after that. The case became a legal battleground over fundamental questions about personhood, property, and the nature of American law itself. John Jolliffe, a prominent anti-slavery attorney in Cincinnati, took on the Garners' defense. Jolliffe was a fearless advocate who'd been assaulted multiple times for his work defending fugitive slaves. He'd been attacked by a pro-slavery judge, mobbed in Covington, threatened repeatedly. He conducted most of his cases pro bono. For the Garners, he developed a two-pronged legal strategy. First, he argued that Margaret had been brought into Ohio on previous occasions by the Gaines family on shopping trips and business matters. Under Ohio law, which forbade slavery on Ohio soil, this meant she and her children had actually become free the moment they'd set foot in the state, even if they hadn't realized it at the time. If Margaret had been free when her children were born, then they were born free, and Gaines had no legal claim to them. It was a clever argument, and the court actually agreed that Margaret would have been free at those times if only she had claimed her freedom. But because she had voluntarily returned to Kentucky with the Gaines family, the court ruled she had surrendered that freedom. And now, being in Ohio as fugitives without their owner's consent, they were subject to being returned to his custody under the Fugitive Slave Act. Then Jolliffe tried something extraordinary, something that seemed insane on its face. He asked the county prosecutor to indict his own clients for murder. He wanted Margaret charged with killing her daughter. Why would a defense attorney want his client charged with a capital crime? Because if Margaret were indicted for murder in Ohio, she would be tried as a person, not as property. She would have legal standing. She would be recognized by the law as a human being capable of committing crimes, which meant she was a human being capable of having rights. And, more immediately, if she were indicted in Ohio, she couldn't be returned to Kentucky while she was awaiting trial. Jolliffe even told the court that his clients had assured him they would go singing to the gallows rather than return to slavery. The trial became a spectacle. Newspapers across the nation covered it. The courtroom was packed. Representing Archibald Gaines and James Marshall were Colonel Francis T. Chambers of Cincinnati and 2 lawyers from Covington. They argued straightforwardly. The Fugitive Slave Act was federal law, and federal law superseded state law. Gaines and Marshall had obtained legal warrants for the return of their property. The law was clear. On the last day of the trial, Lucy Stone gave a public address on behalf of the Garner family. Stone was a remarkable figure, an Oberlin College graduate who would become one of the nation's leading abolitionists and women's rights advocates. She'd married Henry Blackwell just 9 months earlier in a ceremony where the couple had issued a protest against the traditional subservient role of wives, and she'd kept her own surname, the first woman in America to do so. Now she stood before the crowd and laid bare the sexual abuse Margaret had suffered. The faded faces of Margaret's children, Stone said, told too plainly to what degradation female slaves were forced to submit. Rather than give her daughter to that life, Margaret had killed her. Stone later said that with her own teeth, she would tear open her veins and let the earth drink her blood rather than wear chains of slavery. How then could she blame Margaret for wishing her child to find freedom with God and the angels, where no chains existed? While Margaret sat in jail awaiting the verdict, she received numerous visitors. Levi Coffin came. He would later write that those who came to speak words of comfort and cheer felt them die upon their lips when they looked into Margaret's face and marked its expression of settled despair. Her sorrow was beyond the reach of any words of encouragement and consolation. When visitors complimented her surviving son Thomas, Margaret replied sadly, "You should have seen my little girl that died. That was the bird." The Cincinnati Daily Gazette reported that during the trial, Margaret sat holding her infant daughter Priscilla. The baby's little hands were continually fondling her mother's face, but Margaret rarely noticed. Her general expression was one of extreme sadness. On February 26, 1856, Commissioner John L. Pendery issued his ruling. The Fugitive Slave Act held precedence over state law. Margaret Garner and her children were property, and they were to be returned to Archibald Gaines. Robert, Simon, and Mary were returned to James Marshall. Ohio authorities scrambled to get an extradition warrant for Margaret on murder charges, but Gaines moved quickly. He knew what the abolitionists were attempting. He kept Margaret moving between different cities in Kentucky, making it impossible for Ohio officials to serve the warrant. They missed finding her in Covington by a few hours. They missed her again in Frankfort. By the time they caught up with Gaines in Louisville, he'd already put the Garners on a steamboat headed down the Ohio River to his brother's plantation in Arkansas. Ohio Governor Salmon P. Chase, himself a committed abolitionist, was furious. Kentucky Governor Charles S. Moorhead expressed extreme regret and indignation at Gaines's actions, promising to do everything in his power to return Margaret to Ohio for trial. Gaines was publicly denounced for his duplicity. He responded with an indignant letter to the Cincinnati Enquirer, claiming he had twice made Margaret available to Ohio authorities, but that Chase had taken too much time each time. He had doubts, he said, that the abolitionists really wanted to bring her to Ohio at all, that they just wanted to use her for their political gain. It was a remarkable display of projection from a man who had just spent weeks using Margaret's enslavement as a test case for his property rights. On March 6, 1856, the steamboat Henry Louis was making its way down the Ohio River with the Garners aboard when it collided with another vessel. The boat began to sink. The chaos, Margaret and her infant daughter Priscilla were thrown overboard. Some accounts say they were knocked overboard during the collision. Others say Margaret deliberately jumped while holding the baby. Either way, the result was the same. Margaret was pulled from the water. The baby drowned. The Liberator, the abolitionist newspaper, reported that Margaret expressed what witnesses called frantic joy that her baby had died. She had tried to drown herself, but had failed. The child Margaret had held through the trial, the baby whose little hands had played with her mother's face while Margaret sat in despair, was now dead. Spared, as Margaret would have seen it, from a life in bondage. Margaret and Robert were kept in Arkansas only briefly before being sent to New Orleans to work as house servants for friends of the Gaines family. Then, in 1857, they were sold to Judge DeWitt Clinton Bonham and sent to his plantation at Tennessee Landing, Mississippi. Bonham owned more than 160 enslaved people who worked his large cotton plantation. Margaret's life had gone from the relative privilege of house service in Kentucky to hard labor in the Deep South cotton fields. In 1870, a reporter from the Cincinnati Chronicle tracked down Robert Garner after the Civil War and interviewed him about what had happened to Margaret. Robert said she had died in 1858 during a typhoid fever epidemic that swept through the Mississippi Valley. Before she died, Robert said, Margaret had urged him to never marry again in slavery, but to live in hope of freedom. Her burial location remains unknown. Margaret Garner's story became national news during her trial, but its impact extended far beyond the immediate moment. The case crystallized arguments on both sides of the slavery debate in ways few other incidents had. For abolitionists, Margaret's act demonstrated the absolute horror of slavery, that it could drive a mother to kill her own children rather than see them enslaved. It made the abstract arguments about human bondage terribly, viscerally real. For pro-slavery advocates, Margaret's act was evidence that enslaved people were incapable of civilized behavior, that they lacked the moral capacity for true maternal feeling. The Cincinnati press described how Margaret had hacked at her child's throat with swift and terrible force, again and again until the little girl was almost decapitated. Language designed to make Margaret seem monstrous rather than desperate. But something else happened in the coverage of Margaret's case. People began asking questions that struck at the heart of how slavery functioned. If enslaved people were just property, as the law insisted, then how could Margaret be blamed for destroying property that belonged to someone else? But if she could be blamed, if she was morally responsible for her actions, then she must be a person, not property, and persons can't be owned. The contradictions became impossible to ignore. The case forced Americans to confront what they'd been trying not to see: that slavery required treating human beings as things, and that this fundamental lie created moral paradoxes that no legal reasoning could resolve. Kentucky painter Thomas Satterwhite Noble created a painting called The Modern Medea in 1867, depicting the moment the marshals burst into Kite's cabin. The painting shows a distraught Margaret and her children, while horrified white men recoil from the scene. Noble took significant artistic liberties with the facts. He replaced Margaret's infant daughter with 2 fictitious sons, perhaps because the death of young male slaves would have had a larger financial impact, and thus made Margaret's crime seem worse to pro-slavery viewers. He left the murder weapon out of Margaret's hands, creating ambiguity about responsibility. The painting became famous, was reproduced in Harper's Weekly, and hung in galleries where Americans could contemplate what had happened in that cabin. Noble himself wasn't known to be an abolitionist. Like much of the response to Margaret's story, the painting revealed as much about the anxieties of white Americans as it did about Margaret's actual experience. In 1859, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper published a poem called The Slave Mother, A Tale of Ohio, directly inspired by Margaret's story. In 1856, John Jolliffe himself wrote a novel called Belle Scott that drew on elements of Margaret's case. But the most enduring artistic response to Margaret Garner's life came much later, from an author who would win both the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Toni Morrison first encountered Margaret's story in 1973 while working as an editor at Random House. She was helping create the Black Book, a compendium of essays commemorating Black history, when she came across a brief article from 1856 titled A Visit to the Slave Mother Who Killed Her Child. The article stuck with Morrison. In 1987, she published Beloved, a novel that would become one of the most important works of American literature. Morrison's protagonist, Seth, is based on Margaret Garner. The novel tells the story of an escaped slave woman haunted by the ghost of the daughter she killed to save from slavery. Beloved doesn't attempt to recreate Margaret's actual life. Morrison deliberately researched very little about the historical facts, taking what she called a less is more approach. Instead, she used Margaret's story as a starting point to explore the lasting trauma of slavery, the impossible choices it forced on mothers, the ways that violence and love became inseparable under bondage. In 1998, Oprah Winfrey produced and starred in a film adaptation of Beloved. In 2005, Morrison wrote the libretto for an opera called Margaret Garner, with music composed by Richard Danielpour. Through these works, Margaret's story reached millions of people who might never have encountered it otherwise. Her choice, made in a moment of desperation in a frozen cabin in Cincinnati, became a lens through which later generations could examine America's original sin. Today, Thomas Satterwhite Noble's painting, The Modern Medea, hangs in the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, a permanent reminder of what happened in that city in 1856. A historical marker in Boone County, Kentucky, notes the escape and its tragic aftermath. But there's no grave marker for Margaret, no monument, no place where people can go to pay their respects. She died in bondage in Mississippi and was buried in an unmarked grave that has never been located. So, what do we make of Margaret Garner's story? How do we understand what she did in that cabin? Some have called her act one of ultimate maternal love, a mother's willingness to kill her child rather than see her suffer. Others have seen it as evidence of the psychological destruction slavery inflicted, the way it could warp even the most fundamental human bonds. Both interpretations contain truth, but both also risk making Margaret's choice about her psychology, rather than about the system that forced her to make it. What seems most important is this: Margaret Garner should never have had to make that choice. No mother should. The fact that she did, the fact that she chose death over bondage for her children, tells us something essential about what slavery actually was. It wasn't the benign institution that apologists described. It wasn't a system of mutual benefit where enslaved people were cared for by benevolent masters. It was a system of violence and violation so terrible that death seemed preferable to it. Margaret knew what slavery meant because she'd lived it. She'd been separated from her own mother's protection as a child. She'd been struck in the face by a white man. She'd been repeatedly raped by the man who claimed to own her. She'd watched her children born into the same bondage. She'd seen them marked from birth by the circumstances of their conception. And she knew that her daughters would face the same violations she had faced, that her sons would grow up knowing they could be sold away from their families at any moment, that none of them would ever have legal rights to their own bodies or lives. When she picked up that knife, she wasn't acting out of madness or lack of maternal feeling. She was acting from the clearest understanding of what their future held. The tragedy isn't that Margaret killed her child. The tragedy is that slavery made that seem like the merciful choice. The legal battle over Margaret's case hinged on whether she should be treated as a person or as property. But that framing itself reveals the fundamental impossibility at the heart of American slavery. You can't have it both ways. Either enslaved people were human beings with moral agency and legal rights, in which case slavery was a crime against humanity and had to be abolished. or they were property without rights or agency, in which case the entire legal and moral architecture of American society was based on a lie so fundamental it poisoned everything it touched. The Fugitive Slave Act tried to resolve this contradiction by treating enslaved people as property while they were running away, but expecting them to behave with the moral restraint of persons while they were enslaved. It was an incoherent position, and Margaret's case exposed that incoherence for everyone to see. 5 years after Margaret's trial, the Civil War began. The conflict had many causes, but at its heart was the question Margaret's case had raised. Could a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal continue to enslave millions of its people? The answer, written in blood across 4 years of war, was no. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, 7 years after Margaret's death. She never lived to see it. Neither did Mary, her daughter, or Priscilla, her infant. They never knew freedom. But the choice Margaret made in that cabin helped push the nation toward a reckoning with what slavery actually meant. Her story made it impossible for people to look away from what was being done in their name. When we remember Margaret Garner today, we should remember her not as a cautionary tale or a symbol, but as a real woman who lived through horrors we can barely imagine, and made a choice that no one should ever have to make. We should remember that she told Lucy Stone her daughter Mary was the bird, suggesting something beautiful and precious that she'd tried to set free the only way she knew how. We should remember that she sat in jail with her infant daughter's hands on her face, lost in a despair so deep that witnesses couldn't find words to reach it. We should remember that before she died, she told her husband to live in hope of freedom, even though she'd never experienced it herself. And we should remember that her story isn't just history. The questions it raises about freedom, about motherhood, about the value we place on human life and human dignity, about what people will do when pushed to the edge of what anyone should have to endure. Those questions are still with us. Margaret Garner's choice, made on a frozen January morning in 1856, still asks us to look clearly at the systems of violence and oppression in our world, still asks us to imagine what we might do in her place, still demands that we reckon with the costs of treating any human being as less than fully human. That's Margaret Garner's legacy. Not the knife, not the blood, not the tragic death of a beautiful child, but the question that her choice forces us to confront. What kind of world do we want to live in? What are we willing to do to make that world real? Margaret never got to answer those questions for herself. The least we can do is try to answer them for ourselves, in her memory, in memory of Mary and Priscilla and all the millions who died in bondage, and in hope for a future where no one ever has to make the choice that Margaret Garner made.